That's very powerful evidence that the universe was created with intention. And among those intentions, which we cannot fully apprehend, is the to permit life to exist. And I found myself saying, I can't believe I'm thinking this, but I don't see what alternative I have. Well, I actually did have a sort of road to Damascus moment, but it wasn't spiritual, it was empirical. And it was when I read this little slim book called Just Six Numbers by Martin Rees, who was the Astronomer Royal in Britain. And Just Six Numbers describes some of the parameters in the anthropic principle, which you're familiar with, of course. The anthropic principle that says the chances that the universe we live in would support life are literally 1 in trillions, in trillions. And Francis Collins does a very good job of summarizing this in the language of God, where he says, look, you've got 3 alternatives. You can say there are multiple universes, which is what the physicists have tried to, I think, take up as a last resort, which I don't think passes the smile test. You could say, well, we're here, so there's no point in thinking about it. And I don't think that works if you're talking about a 1 in a trillion chance. Or you can say, that's very powerful evidence that the universe was created with intention. And among those intentions, which we cannot fully apprehend, is to permit life to exist. And I found myself saying, I can't believe I'm thinking this, but I don't see what alternative I have.
Well, the second option that you raise, not thinking about it, I think many people take that tack. They just don't think about it, because if you dare to think about it, you're going to be in trouble. If you dare to confront, I mean, I've said to people, honestly, if you dare to read just my book, I mean, there's so many books on this subject. I'm not familiar with the Rees book, but I've heard of it. I haven't read it, but I've heard of it. But if you dare just to read my book, I'm just curious what people would think. And if you're a hardcore atheist, I would guarantee, if you read it honestly, you cannot be an atheist. You can be an agnostic. You can have a million questions. I think it's healthy to have questions. But the idea that there's no God becomes preposterous, not just, maybe wrong, but absolutely preposterous. And when you're talking about, 6 numbers, the idea that, life just exists and we'll take it for granted. Well, if you begin to look at it more closely, if you have the tools of science, which we didn't have 100 or 200 years ago, to really examine the fine tuning, then you can just shrug and think what you like. But suddenly now we have the fine tuning argument, and it's not one argument. I mean, the fine tuning argument applies to almost an infinity of things. So we're kind of in a new day. That's really what I keep talking about, is that science has given us the ability to see what we could not have seen in a previous century.
Another aspect of that is what we know about consciousness through developing bodies of data that are increasingly meeting all the scientific standards for what Carl Sagan used to say was necessary when he said extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Well, I think in the bodies of evidence regarding near-death experiences and the body of evidence regarding what's called terminal lucidity, where people with advanced dementia in the hours before death have come back in terms of their personalities, their memories, their recognition for brief periods of time. You cannot absorb those and still be confident that consciousness can exist only in the brain. There seems to be too much out there which says, no, actually, consciousness can exist independently of the brain, which in turn opens up the possibility of the human soul.
It really is an extraordinary thing, because, again, a strict materialist insists that the brain is all there is, that there's no mind. And as you just said, what do you do with the evidence? Thousands of people earnestly telling stories that work against that. What do you do with that? And I think there are plenty of people that they have to say, it's kind of like coming up with the multiverse theory. It's so silly, but they are more comfortable putting forward a really silly theory like the multiverse theory, or the idea that, oh, it was something you ate or was a hallucination. They don't seem willing to be able honestly to deal with it.
I look upon what's happened to science as William James did. When William James talked about scientism, scientism is the acquisition of a lot of characteristics of a religion by science. You know, the Enlightenment went a lot farther than saying that logic and empiricism are very powerful tools for understanding the universe. That was fine. But they said that's the only permissible way to explore the meaning of the universe, and everything else is ruled out. And so it's not that I have gotten a serious reaction to the parts of the book that deal with consciousness. So far, the reaction has been more of, how dare you suggest that this evidence needs to be taken seriously, because we all know that that's supernatural hocus pocus and there can't possibly be anything to it. And in effect, there are hypotheses and signs and evidence that scientists who are otherwise very reasonable people, it's like they plug their ears and say, I can't hear you, I can't hear you.
Ironically, they become emotional and illogical.
Yes, very, very emotional.
It's and ironic is it's a polite word. Hypocritical, I think, would be more to the point. And they don't care that they're being hypocrites, that they're denying the very things that they continue to claim. It's so interesting. You mentioned scientism. Scientism is at odds with actual science, which says we will follow the evidence wherever it leads. We know that in the Big Bang, the evidence leads to a singularity, to a moment where literally out of nothing, all of the space and time in the universe is created. That's what science tells us. And I think it's one of those things that for many decades, it made many scientists cringe and writhe. We cannot. This makes us uncomfortable. It actually made Einstein uncomfortable. I don't know if you know the story, but his equations were revealing, around 1915, the universe is expanding. And he thought, oh no, that won't do. I have to create this cosmological constant because it's embarrassing. It looks like there was a beginning. It's pointing too much toward religion. And even the great Einstein was insecure among the other scientists who had bought into this scientific idea that we can't even look in that direction of a singularity. So in some ways, the whole thing is kind of funny.
Jastrow, I think it's Robert Jastrow, who was an astrophysicist, had a wonderful line in his book about the whole story of the Big Bang. He said, it ends like a bad dream for a scientist. We clamber up the mountain trying to reach the summit of total knowledge, and we pull ourselves over the last rock, and the band of theologians has been sitting there for centuries. And that is, look, the Big Bang is a gloss on Genesis. It's Genesis recast as science. Let there be light. And there was light.